Should you use open source software? 100%. Remember, the top 3 rules of software development are: reuse is number 1. Number 2, reuse. Number 3 is reuse. It's kind of my play on the top 3 rules of real estate. Top 3 rules of real estate are location, number 1. Number 2, location. Number 3, location. In software development, the last thing you want to do, let me say it again, the last thing you want to do is reinvent the wheel, is to write code that somebody has already written. If everybody rewrote everything from scratch every time, you would never get anything done. We would be back 30 years in terms of our software development. Remember, when you're using a high-level language like a JavaScript, or you're using a Python, or using a PHP, using a C# or a Java, you're using somebody else's code. You're actually using code based on other code. So, to have this notion that it's best to rewrite from scratch is something that young developers have. I remember back in the day, 8,000 years ago, when I first started out this stuff, a couple of years into it, I had this idea that it was best to rewrite code from scratch all the time. No. You don't want to do that. You want to be using other people's code as much as possible. Open source is great because you can go in there and make mods if you need to, although I'm reluctant to touch open source code, especially for my particular project, because let's say you're building a web app for somebody, pick your language, doesn't matter, and then you find yourself wanting to modify some open source project that or open source library that you want to utilize for your web project. And that's cool. But the problem with that, if you modify some open source project with some custom code, if you do it in a bad way, meaning you change the core aspects of the open source project for your project. I'm not talking about if you contribute to some open source project. The problem with that approach is that you basically just forked your code, meaning if you fork the code, that means that when the open source community makes updates to the library, you're going to have a hard time implementing those updates because you forked your code, because you've made modifications. So number 1, you want to use open source code as much as possible. Don't want to rewrite your own code. That's just silly, waste of time. Number 2, if you feel a need to be able to have to modify the behavior of some library, what you should do is hopefully the library or the framework has some sort of open source, some plugin architecture rather, so that you can make modifications without having to worry about it, It's, what do I mean by that? So for example, WordPress, big open source content management system, and it has a plugin architecture. So what that means is that you have the ability to add functionality to WordPress without touching the core, so that you can take advantage of all the WordPress updates. So now I'm going to give you guys a nice 360 view. All right, 360 view, normal view. We'll see what happens. All right. See what I do for you guys. Give me a tour of the city. Travel Montreal and code. So yeah, use open source projects without a doubt. Remember the top 3 rules of software development: reuse, reuse, reuse. Don't reinvent the wheel. Whatever cliche you want to use, this is relevant. So, yeah, there's a big bump coming here.